This morning is about vengeance, payback, getting back at people. And the text of our message today is taken from Romans chapter 12, verses 17 through 19. So Paul, in writing to the church at Rome, says, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." In 1882, a New York City business person named Joseph Richardson owned a very narrow strip of land on Lexington Avenue. And as you're looking at this slide, Lexington Avenue is the street that is on your right, where you see the cars traversing back and forth. This strip of land that he owned was 5 feet wide. It was 104 feet long. Now, another businessman named Hyman Sanar owned the normal-sized lot adjacent to Richard's little skinny one, which is the apartment complex that you see there on your left. And Mr. Sarner wanted to build apartments that fronted Lexington Avenue. So he offered Mr. Richardson $1,000 for this little skinny 5-foot, 104-foot lot. Richardson was deeply offended by the offer and countered with a demand for $5,000. Mr. Sarner refused to pay him the $5,000. Richardson then called Mr. Sarner a tightwad and slammed the door in his face. Now, Mr. Sarner assumed that Mr. Richardson's land would remain vacant, this little 5-foot strip. So he told his architect to design the apartment building so that the windows would overlook Lexington Avenue. However, when Mr. Richardson saw the finished building, he was determined to block the view to Lexington Avenue. No one was going to enjoy a free view over his property. So, at 70 years of age, Mr. Richardson built a house on this lot, which is what you see. This house, there on the right, is 5 feet wide, 104 feet long, and 4 stories high. It had 2 suites, as you would call it, on each floor, and he was also smart enough to take advantage of a local building code that allowed him to build bay window extensions onto the building, which would then allow him to extend its maximum width by another 2 feet 3 inches. So if you can kind of, obviously it's a very old photograph, but you can kind of see on the right-hand side of this house these little pop-out sections. This is the additional 2 feet 3 inches that he was able to gain for each of the 4 suites in his house. The bedrooms of the house were in these bay room extensions, and upon completion, he and his wife moved into one of the suites. Of course, only one person could climb the stairs at any given time and pass through the hallway. The largest dining room table in any suite was only 18 inches wide. The stoves were the smallest that could possibly have been made. And in fact, one time a very robust newspaper reporter once got stuck in their stairwell, and after 2 tenants were unsuccessful trying to remove him and extricate him from the stairwell, he basically stripped down to his underwear and then he was able to get out. This house that was built by Mr. Richardson was called the Spite House. And Mr. Richardson and his wife lived in that house for 14 years, all in this very narrow residence. Because apparently it seemed to fit his very narrow mind. Now, I will tell you that eventually it was torn down in 1915. But until then it stood. And Mr. Richardson and his wife, for 14 years, lived in a house of spite. And spite does that. It builds a really lonely house. It's space there only for one person, and the lives of its tenants are reduced to one singular goal, and that is to make someone miserable. And it works. Unfortunately, the person that it makes miserable is the person who's trying to be spiteful. And so it's no wonder that in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15, the writer says that we keep a sharp eye out for weeds of bitter discontent, because a thistle or two gone to seed can ruin a whole garden in no time. God's healing, on the other hand, moves us out of a spite house like this, away from this very cramped world of grudges that sometimes we carry, toward his more spacious ways of grace and forgiveness. He moves us forward by healing our past. But can he really do that for you? Can he really do that for me? Because we think, can God really move me past this mess that is my life? Or this history of sexual abuse I've been forced to endure? Or this raw anger I have at a father maybe who left my mother? Or the seething disgust that I feel every time that I think about the person who treated me like yesterday's garbage? Can God really heal that kind of ancient hurt that so many of us carry in our hearts? And I will tell you the answer is yes. And I'm going to use the Old Testament character of Joseph to explain that process, because Joseph asked these very same questions. And as most of you know, the truth is you never, ever, ever outlive the memory of 10 brothers essentially giving you the heave-ho and leaving you for dead. They walked away from him and they never came back. So Joseph then decided to give them a taste of their own medicine. When he saw them in the breadline in Egypt, as you recall, he snapped at them. He accused them of being spies, and he threw all 10 of them in jail. Revenge. Finally, my brothers got their just comeuppance. And isn't it sometimes just a little comforting to think that Joseph was actually a human being? Because sometimes we think this guy is so good that it hurts. Joseph, as you know, endured slavery. He succeeded in a foreign country. He mastered a new language. He resisted sexual seductions. He was a model prisoner. He was the perfect counselor to the king. We expect him to kind of hover or levitate. Or when we see him seeing his brothers, we would expect Joseph to say, "Father, forgive them. They didn't know what they were doing." Like Jesus said in Luke chapter 23, verse 34. But Joseph didn't do that. He didn't, because forgiving jerks is really hard to do sometimes. We'll feed the poor. We'll give counsel to the king. We'll even memorize the book of Numbers if God told us to. But where Paul writes to the church in Ephesus in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, encouraging us, don't let the sun go down while you are still angry. Does God really expect me to do that? Or let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. The same church, the same author, the same chapter, just verse 31. Or in Colossians, Paul is writing, which we're studying now in the adult class, chapter 3, verse 1, as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. And we read those scriptures, and we feel this anger, and we ask ourselves, God, do you really expect me to not carry a grudge and to forgive? And the truth is that God cares about justice a whole lot more than we do. Paul admonished the church in Rome to never pay back evil for evil, to never avenge yourselves. Just leave that to God. For he has said he will repay those who deserve it. That's our text, Romans chapter 12, verses 17 and 19. Our problem is that we fear that the evildoer will somehow slip into the night, unknown, never discovered, and never, ever punished. But the Scripture says for us not to worry. Scripture says God will repay, not might repay, maybe will repay, but God will repay. God will execute justice on behalf of truth and fairness. And here's the case in point. I want you to consider, going back to our Joseph story, one of the most surprising turnarounds in that story. So after 3 days, Joseph releases all but one of the brothers from the jail. Remember that? And they returned to Canaan to report to their dad, Jacob, who was then just but a shadow of his former self. The brothers told him that Simeon was kept in Egypt as assurance that they would return back to Egypt with their youngest brother, Benjamin. Recall that that's what Joseph wanted to see, his father and his youngest brother. Jacob had nothing to say except the following. And you can find this in Genesis chapter 42, verse 36. And this is in response to Simeon saying, Dad, we need to take Benjamin back to, Judah telling his dad, we need to take Benjamin back to Egypt, otherwise Simeon is going to be executed. You've taken my children from me, Joseph's gone, Simeon's gone, and now you're taking Benjamin. All this can't really be happening to me. And when you think about it, he is such a louse. Jacob played favorites, as you know. He refused to discipline his kids. He had multiple wives. And upon hearing of the imprisonment of his son, he melts down and has a pity party. I mean, he is just a prima donna. No wonder the family was screwed up. But as we read further, a light breaks through. Judah, who once wanted to get rid of Joseph, steps forward and says the following in Genesis chapter 43, verses 8 through 9. Send the boy, referring to Benjamin, with me, and we will be on our way. Otherwise, we will all die of starvation. And not only we, but you and our little ones. You may personally hold me responsible if I don't bring him back to you. I personally guarantee his safety. Let me bear the blame forever. If we hadn't wasted all this time, we could have gone and returned twice by now. I want you to camp out on this statement by Judah, because is this the same Judah? The same man who said, let's sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites in Genesis chapter 37, verse 27? The same brother who helped negotiate the slave trade? And the answer is, well, yes and no. Because Judah, as it turns out, had had his own personal descent into the pit. You see, church, after Joseph's abduction and sale to eventually Egypt, Judah went on to have 3 boys of his own. And he arranged for his eldest son to marry a girl named Tamar. But the son died. So, following the proper protocol of that day, Judah arranged for his second son to marry Tamar. But that son didn't manage the situation very well, and he died too. Judah, by now, is assuming that Tamar was somehow jinxed, and he, being afraid, thinking that his third son would meet the same fate as his older brothers, decided to put the marital matter on hold, which then left Tamar with no husband. And then sometime later, Judah's wife dies as well. So I'll remember this. Judah has 3 sons. 2 of them have died, married to the same woman, and now Judah's wife has passed away as well. So one day, Tamar heard that Judah was coming into town. Apparently, she hadn't been able to get Judah, her former or still current father-in-law, to reply to her texts, so Tamar decided to get a little creative. She disguised herself as a prostitute and made him an offer. And Judah took the bait. And Judah, in exchange for sex, gave her a ring and his walking stick or staff. Now, of course, Judah is totally unaware that he was sleeping with his own daughter-in-law. But as luck would have it, she conceived. And 3 months later, she reappears in Judah's life as Tamar, the very pregnant Tamar. So Judah, upon seeing her, gets all high and mighty on her and says that he wants her to be burned to death. That's when Tamar produces the ring and the staff, and Judah knows he's busted. He realizes the child that Tamar is carrying is his own. He was caught in his own sin. He's disgraced in front of his own family. You see, church, God had worked out circumstances where things had come now full circle, because Judah, who had deceived Jacob, had now been deceived. Judah, who had trapped Joseph, was now trapped like a rat. Judah, who had helped to humiliate Joseph, was now humiliated himself. You see, church, God gave Judah his comeuppance, and Judah came to his senses, because in Genesis chapter 38, verse 26, he declares, she, Tamar, has been more righteous than I. And for years, I wondered why this story about Judah's exploits are included in this Joseph narrative, because they kind of interrupt everything. I mean, we just get started in chapter 37 with the dreams and the drama of Joseph, when the narrator apparently decides to stop the narrative and dedicate chapter 38 to the story of Judah the hustler and Tamar the escort, including 2 dead husbands, 1 clever widow. And I'm thinking, this is really an odd place to put that story. But in thinking about it now, I see how it fits. You see, church, Because for anything good to happen to Jacob's family, someone in the family had to grow up. And if it wasn't going to be their dad, then one of the boys had to mature to the point where he took responsibility for his actions. God activated that change in Judah. He gave the guy a taste of his own medicine, and the medicine worked because now Judah is championing the family cause. He speaks sense into his father's head. He was willing to take responsibility for Benjamin's safety and bear the blame if he failed. Judah, you see, got his wake-up call, and Joseph didn't have to lift a finger or swing a fist. You see, church, vengeance is God's. He will repay. Whether ultimately on the day of judgment or perhaps intermediately in this life, the point of the story is that God handles all of the Judahs in our world. He can discipline your abusive boss. He can soften an angry parent. He can bring your ex to his knees or her to her senses. Forgiveness doesn't diminish justice. It just simply entrusts it to God. And God guarantees the right retribution. We give too much or we give too little. But the God of justice has the precise prescription. And unlike us, God never, ever, ever gives up on a person. Long after we've moved on, God is still there, probing the conscience, stirring conviction, always attempting to orchestrate the person's redemption. Fixing our enemies, that is God's job. Forgiving our enemies, that's where you and I come in. We forgive. Paul, in writing the church in Ephesus, chapter 4, verses 26 through 27 says, "Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity." I want to camp out on that word opportunity. It's basically a translation from a Greek word, topos, T-O-P-O-S. And it's the same term for which we get the English noun topography. It means territory or ground. And I think it's an interesting use of that word because Paul, in writing to the church in Ephesus, is saying that anger gives ground to Satan. Bitterness invites him to occupy a space in your heart, kind of like renting a room. And he will. He'll camp out, and the wages that he pays you for giving him the space is gossip, slander, temper. I mean, anytime you see these things, Satan has claimed a bunk in your house. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? Well, what you would do with any poor tenant is that you evict them. And that's the act of forgiveness. Forgiveness evicts the person who's dwelling in your conscience and your heart. Don't give Satan the time of day. Begin that process of forgiveness. Keep no list of wrongs. Pray for your antagonists rather than plotting against them. Hate the wrong without hating the wrongdoer. Turn your attention from what they did to you and instead turn your attention to Jesus Christ and what he did for you. Outrageous as it may seem, Jesus died for those folks too. And if he thinks they're worth forgiving, then they are. Now, does that make forgiveness easy? No. Does it make it quick? Seldom. Does it make it painless? Hardly. And it wasn't for Joseph either. The brothers had now returned to Egypt from Canaan, and Benjamin is in tow, if you recall. And Joseph invites them to dinner. And he asks about Jacob, the dad. He spots Benjamin, and Joseph comes all but undone. We read in Genesis chapter 43, verse 29, God be gracious to you, my son. He blurts that out before he has to hurry away from the room so he can have a private moment and bawl his eyes out. Eventually, once he's composed himself, he comes back and returns to eat and to drink and to share pleasantries with his brothers. They just don't know that it's Joseph, their brother. Joseph had even sat all the children at the table in their birth order, from the oldest to the youngest. And then he singles out Benjamin for special treatment. Every time the brothers got something, Benjamin gets 5 times that same amount. The brothers notice this, but they're not going to say anything. Later, Joseph loads their sacks with food and hides his personal cup in the sack of Benjamin. So the brothers, in their haste to leave home, barely get down the road when one of Joseph's stewards stops the caravan and searches their sacks, and guess what they find? The king's cup in Benjamin's sack. The brothers start tearing their clothes. The current kind of trend would be like tearing your hair out, because they know this is not going to be a good ending. And they soon find themselves back in front of Joseph, and they are fearing for their lives. And I'm thinking, why would Joseph do that? Well, apparently, Joseph couldn't completely make up his mind about forgiving his brothers. He welcomed them, he wept over them, he ate with them, and then he pranks them. And I think it's just indicative of the fact that Joseph was at war in his own mind. He ultimately says God intended all this to be for good. But you see the human being Joseph saying, I know I got to forgive him. I know I got to, but I don't want to. And so he pranks him. These brothers had peeled this scab off of Joseph's oldest and deepest wound. And he wasn't about to let them do it again. On the other hand, these were his brothers. And he wasn't going to lose them again either. You see, church, forgiveness vacillates like that. It has its fits and it has its starts. It has its good days and it has its bad days. Anger intermingled with love. Call it irregular mercy. We make progress only to make a wrong turn. We step forward only to then step back. But that's okay. Because when it comes to forgiveness, church, all of us are amateurs. No one owns a secret formula. And as long as we are trying to forgive, we are being forgiving. It's when you no longer try that bitterness sets in and Satan takes up shop. So this week, if this is an issue for you, this vengeance, this getting back at somebody who's done you wrong, I'm encouraging you to try spending less time in the spite house and more time in the grace house. Because I've been there. I've walked in both hallways, church. And I can tell you that the space of grace is preferred over getting stuck in your underwear in a very narrow hallway called vengeance. It's hard to forgive. It's not easy. But we are asked to do that. So this week, if you're harboring a grudge, if you're finding it difficult to forgive somebody, consider the spite house. Consider how a man would build a house 5 feet wide, 140 feet long, 4 stories high, just to spite his neighbor so that his hotel wouldn't have windows overlooking Lexington Avenue. Can you imagine living in a house 5 feet wide for 17 years? All because you didn't want your neighbor to enjoy a view over your property. That's some pretty serious spite. But I tell that story because sometimes I know in my own life personally, I've gone to some pretty significant lengths to get that payback. And it's so easy in the field where I practice because much of my work is litigation. It's people constantly fighting. It's constantly somebody trying to get up on the other person. And so you spend a lot of time trying to figure out, like a chess match, now where are they going to go, and then how can I zing them? So I've been what I'm talking about today. And it's not easy. Sometimes, quite honestly, church, I feel like Jekyll and Hyde. Because my personality is very much like you see now. I'm pretty easygoing. I don't get too stressed about stuff. I don't get too upset about anything. And then I put on my suit, and then I have to be the litigator, the gladiator, the fighter. Sometimes I feel like I'm Jekyll and Hyde. So I've had to deal with this issue, which is one of the reasons why I wrote it. And I'm guessing that occasionally you have too. So this week, spend a little bit more time in the grace house than the spite house. I think you'll find that your spiritual life will improve and the lives of others with whom you associate will too. So if you have a prayer request, now would be the time to pass it up as we sing this last song. If we have any prayer requests, we'll talk about them, we'll pray over them, and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand and let's sing.